what is seeing into the future? It's a simulation. You're creating a model of the world inside of your nervous system that you can test ideas on. We're so used to interacting with a compressed version of the world, when something spits that back at us, we say, wow, magic. Hello friends, I'm back because when I find myself yelling at the radio during a podcast or any other type of thing, it's time to record a vlog. So one of the things I've been listening to lately and have been paying attention to in media and interviews and podcasts and YouTube videos and all that has been the theories of consciousness. I was really inspired by, Lex Fridman and Elon Musk. That was the fourth time he was on there. I always catch those guys. They always have such great conversations. But one of the things that Elon says that always strikes me, he said this in the past, is one day we'll figure out what that combination of things is that means consciousness, right? And there were some other folks that have been on that podcast and many others and in research and all of that, where they're talking about consciousness and they're coming at it from many different angles that are quite complex, right? So Roger Penrose, he has this idea that related to the collapse of the wave function, consciousness can't possibly be computational, right? It must have some kind of quantum mechanical aspect to it. And it makes sense. He's a physicist and, must be a physics problem, and it must not fit into what we normally understand. It has to be some kind of esoteric thing. Well, I like to come back to what the evolutionary biologists are talking about, which is why consciousness in the first place, right? I think if we apply some first principles, we can come up with the why and then maybe work backwards evolutionarily and figure out why we came to have something that we're calling consciousness now, and what it would take to either recreate that or understand it better, or at least have more of a framework to think about consciousness in a way that's useful, right? So there's been gobs of amazing research done by extremely well-qualified people. I am an old Gen X metalhead who does audio and signal processing for a living, not dabbling, but working pretty heavily into machine learning for audio and things like that. So I'm kind of coming at this from a very high level, more in the 10,000 foot, looking down at all these different folks having these conversations. I'm not deep down in the weeds. And I'm sure that folks would have a lot to say about the details of what I'm saying, but I'm trying to kind of dig myself out of the details because I feel that folks are kind of getting lost when it comes to that conversation about consciousness. You get too far down in the weeds, everything starts looking like what you applied your PhD to. So when we're taking a first principles approach to consciousness, let's go way back, and I can give you a bit of a preface on where I'm getting some of my ideas from. Evolutionary biology. I've listened to Nick Lane, his concepts about evolutionary biology and how life evolved on this planet and why resonate very well with me. A lot of that makes total sense. Jeremy England, he's the one of the first thermodynamics guys when it comes to life evolving from nothing. So, let's take that evolutionary arms race approach to consciousness and try to work back or work forwards from first principles from, archaea, single-celled organisms, all the way up through where we are today. Understanding that we had this Precambrian explosion, right, where for billions of years we had single-cell organisms. Now, all of a sudden, due to some change in the environment, sulfur in the oceans or something like that. Now a cell can be within a cell. We have organelles. We have this explosion in complexity where now we have multicellular organisms and the race is on, right? Because of the thermodynamic nature of life and, the churn that's happening inside of our oceans and that fertile ground for the evolution, we start to see, hands, eyes, claws, mouths, digestive tracts, like all of these things start to happen because the reactions that are happening inside of this organism tended to allow that population to grow, right? Remember, none of this is designed. So that's why I'm trying to start all the way back from the beginning. There's no design here. It's all selection. Evolution's always building on what came before, right? So if we're building on what came before, what would give an organism some type of advantage in its particular environment, especially once you're away from the hydrothermal vents. Now you're into the ocean. There's food floating around. There's things trying to eat you. Just sensing the environment gives you some level of action in the world, right? So, for example, if there's some group of cells that are sensitive to light, that may trigger some extremely rudimentary behavior, such as the flagella on that side are going to turn you until you're moving towards the light. That's basically what was probably happening in the very early stages of life, as these things were evolving, right? Just that right there is a massive advantage over all of the other multicellular animals that couldn't do that. Once they all can do that, now we've got a real arms race going, right? So you've got the beginning of a nervous system where some group of cells is now affecting the behavior of the whole, right? And we can even see this in jellyfish, where they're even a colony of single-celled organisms, and they can even have that kind of reaction, but it's a mechanical one. Let's just call that a mechanical reaction to the environment, right? There's no reasoning happening. It is a reaction, right? This changing chemicals, this behavior that has been, we can't call it pre-programmed. It just is, right? The evolution brought it to a place to have this particular behavior, right? But it's not reasoning. This is a mechanical attachment to the environment. And that's enough for a lot of creatures, right? So as things became more and more complex, we have to build another layer on top of that very simple reaction to the environment. The ability to see into the future became a thing, right? And we can see how that happened in very tiny, slow steps over that hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years of evolution, where those creatures that could predict the environment or have some kind of understanding are going to do much better than those that can't, right? Now, the next layer up, we can kind of think of, I'm not a biologist. I'm going to get a lot of this wrong. Just bear with me. A fish. We know some fish, in our oceans today, they can learn to solve mazes. They have a few seconds of short-term memory. They've got the next layer above simply reacting to their environment, right? Like an amoeba or a planaria. Well, planaria because they're multicellular, right? They are multicellular, but they're having a very simple interaction with their environment, whereas a fish has very complex interaction with its environment, right? So it does have eyes, it does have a sense of touch, it does have, every single cell in its body is feeding into a nervous system that has evolved to give it the behaviors of that fish so it can do better. We don't know if that can be considered consciousness yet, because we don't know if the next layer above that is present, right? So remember, first layer, simply reacting. Next layer, many inputs with a ability to have some type of a memory, right? Fish have a bit of a short-term memory. They can react to the environment. They might learn a little bit, but I don't think a fish can see into the future. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now, say there's another breakthrough of evolution into the next layer of complexity. So we don't like to use the word emergence all the time, but emerging from the increase in complexity could have been a bit of that predictive value, right? And it was so funny because in the Roger Penrose interview, he's wondering about understanding and at the same time saying that consciousness is not computational. And I would argue well, why not, right? You've got a function, which is your environment trying to survive, like whatever the formula is that you're trying to solve that keeps you alive. Yes, the brain is there to compute that problem, right? And it is computational. More on that as we move forward in evolution. So, understanding, what does that even mean, right? What does that next layer up even mean? It means that if you're going to take a step, if you're looking down over a cliff, do you take that step, right? If you're just reacting to your environment, you're moving towards the light, you're going to go over the cliff, right? Of course, because you can't see into the future. However, if you have a sense that down is in that direction, if I step over this cliff, I will fall to my death, then you've just seen the future, right? It's not a complicated problem. A handful of neurons can fit that problem space, right? Maybe you have stereoscopic vision or sonar or whatever. You can tell that down is there, and that's far enough down to kill me, right? And that's something that can be passed on through evolution. However, it is seeing into the future because now you have this level of understanding of your environment that is not just reactionary, right? You are seeing into the future. Now, what is seeing into the future? It's a simulation, right? The consciousness of a being that has the ability to see into the future is simulating what's going to happen, right? How can you do a simulation with just a handful of neurons, right? Well, you have to have that constant cycle of, that constant churn of, okay, what are the stimuli coming in? And then another layer that is doing that, okay, well, I'm going to run through the scenarios of what possible outcomes there may be, and then choose one that seems to keep me alive. I would say that level of interacting with your environment starts to become what we can call consciousness, right? You're seeing into the future. Now, you don't have to necessarily see very far, but you can see that once you're looking into the future by having a system in place that is creating, digital twin is the wrong use of terms, but you're creating a model of the world inside of your nervous system that you can test ideas on, right? That is computation. I'm sorry, but it just is, right? You're running the simulation, the ideas, right? Tokens of experiences that have happened before or have been passed down evolutionarily are going into this simulation. So I know it's a big leap to go from fish to humans, but let's start using our own brains for analogies now, and then we can easily see how the gaps can be filled. But if you're running a simulation inside of your nervous system, it has to mirror or be analogous to the super duper complex environment that you're in, right? We know that neural networks are compressing all of the data that they have, right? We start looking at large language models. What we've learned about our own language through LLMs is that, well, guess what? All of that language that we think is so special really can be reduced and compressed into a function, right? It may be billions of parameters, but it is a compressible, knowable thing, right? All of human knowledge, it's a compressible thing. It's amazing, right? It really seems like magic, but it's really because we're so used to interacting with a compressed version of the world. When something spits that back at us, we say, wow, magic, right? But it's not. It really is computational. Consciousness is computational because it's a simulation, right? So let's just keep going with this simulation idea. If we think about how we sit there, we daydream, we could be looking off into space. We're not interacting with the environment whatsoever, but there's that piece of our brain that is receiving from our subconscious, which is also computational, right? It's receiving what I can call a token of an idea or an experience. Let's feed that into the simulation. Having language is the tokenization of that simulation, right? That is what consciousness is, right? Now, things that are happening in our subconscious can happen and do happen in parallel. The fact that I'm moving my arms around, the fact that I can walk and also have this conversation and know if a tiger's about to attack me because I smell something weird, that is all happening in parallel. and is computational. It's just a different layer, right? The us part of us, the ego, that little guy, the homunculus driving the bus, right? It is a one thing at a time. And now it is very fast, but we already know that there's quite a bit of latency for that storyteller part of our brain, right? I think it's around 200 milliseconds. So the subconscious part, the rest of our brain, is doing quite a lot to synchronize the whole world with the simulation that's happening up here, right? Now, this is where I find it super, super interesting and very good for therapy to understand that you have these two parts of your brain, right? Maybe it's id, ego. Folks who know psychology and philosophy are way more versed on this stuff than I am, but you can feel these parallels and these patterns starting to merge, right? So we've got our consciousness. It's telling stories. It is the us that is present in that moment. However, it is being fed by this monstrosity of computation that's happening in the background in parallel, right? That is our subconscious. That's why we can sleep on an idea, wake up, I got it. What do you think, that part of your brain came up with the idea? No. It's the part in the back. It's the this is the tip of the iceberg. The rest of it had that idea because it was running some simulations as well, but it didn't make it up to the very top layer of the simulation that is your brain so that you can solve the next problem and know what to do next in this complex world that we live in. I think this kind of hopefully illuminates some ways that we can move forward and maybe build something that's conscious, right? Something that is continuously simulating and trying to build a model of the world, is trying to fit the world, compression, like a compressor, right? We're trying to fit all of the data coming in, compress it into tokens, and then simulate that in real time, right? That is the conscious part. Now, that is not the same as intelligence, right? We know that being conscious, like any mammal, all mammals, I can assume, are definitely conscious, right? But the levels of intelligence are different, right? I would say that's a layer on top of consciousness. I think a lot of people agree with that. Being able to solve complex problems and do math and solve trajectories of things that are flying at you. Actually, trajectories are all happening in the background, right? The fact that you can play tennis and be daydreaming at the same time, that is a lot of the stuff that's happening in the background. But, things like math, higher level functions, those are happening up here, right? And it's pretty slow for humans. Now, as far as intelligence goes, we're already pretty far along building things that are intelligent. Large language models can solve that problem solving thing in a similar way that humans do. We already know that they're fairly accurate, but they have to test against reality too, right? So I think, maybe Grok and Wolfram Alpha and folks are digging around at the edges of this thing. That's why I think, an AGI can happen pretty soon. As soon as you crack that nut where you're combining a simulation that can see into the future with the ability to have intelligence, you're going to start seeing something that is what we might start to call AGI. You can have a conversation with it that really passes, even the most modern types of Turing tests where, you can have some humor. It's running that simulation. It's aware of, the context that this thing is in, right? Now, that does not give the thing emotions, but it does understand. So let's take a step back now. So we have we know about consciousness, that's a simulation. We know about intelligence, that's solving problems. That's a different, formulation of the network. But those things obviously work together inside us as humans. Now, the human experience is extremely rich because we have that subconscious bombarding our consciousness with ideas. So you kind of have this battle going on, right? And you can see that this is an evolutionary restriction. This is a restriction that evolution has that we don't if we're designing an AI, right? So evolution can only build on what it's done before. But that allows us to kind of understand, okay, here's what our computation looks like. I know it feels special. I know we can still have spirituality and have art in this world. This doesn't have to take us in a nihilistic path, but it does show us that we have to kind of pull back a little bit to understand who we are so that we can do better as humans and build tools for ourselves, right? That are going to help serve our needs and not blow us up. I've already spoken about how I'm not really worried about AI that we build, taking us down and taking over the world. We would have to make it do that. That would be our choice. We could also choose to blow ourselves up with nuclear weapons, but different conversation. I've had that already. What I would propose, if we are going to try to build something that does have consciousness, if you want it to be like a human, you would have to give it the same limitations that a human has, right? So, the human body is part of that entire computer, right? Every single cell in our body is part of that deep, deep well of computation that finally does feed the storyteller, right? However, it's awash with things that just happen to work for life on Earth, right? It is not necessary to have, this, hormonal, emotional type thing in order to have something that is conscious and intelligent at the same time, right? So think about what we have to deal with as humans. Evolution had to deal with a complex nervous system. As nervous systems were evolving and they started getting complex enough to save the lives and extend the lives of the organisms, those extra layers were probably starting to cause problems, right? So the fact that we have this storyteller in our brain means that it has to be reined under control, right? It can't be allowed to go out there and just wreak havoc based only on the simulation, right? The simulation kind of exists on its own. It's a model of the world, so it needs to have inputs, not just from the stimuli that are coming in, right? Obviously we're getting, the results of our vision system, the results of our hearing system, the results of every cell that can feel pain and touch and pressure and all of that, or smell. The lower levels need to be able to affect that higher level in a way that's realistic, right? So if you're moving forward with a simulation of, okay, what am I going to do next? And then you think about, for example, harming someone that you love, right? Evolutionarily, it's a bad idea. We're a tribal, very group-oriented species that does much better together than solo, right? We know that. That's why we want to be around people, even if we think we're a hermit. We kind of need people. It makes us crazy if we don't have that. Well, why does it make us crazy? Why do we feel bad if we're thinking about hurting someone that we love? Well, it's because there had to be some kind of a governing body over that simulation. Otherwise, it's not realistic, right? So, as this storyteller is coming up with ideas, that subconscious part is right there, taking in those ideas, thinking like, well, should we move forward with this? And if it's all like, right, you're going to get this rush of hormones or neurotransmitters or what have you that make you feel bad, right? Or not. You might be a psychopath and perfectly fine with that. But, psychopaths do exist in the world. So, it doesn't have to be a perfect system, but it can be a very diverse system, and everyone can have can range from what we consider to be autistic. Like that's another flavor of human that is capable of a lot of things that someone on some other end of the spectrum might not be capable of, right? So we need everybody in this world to be the best type of society we can be and together move our species forward. But I'm going to probably wrap it up here that I think consciousness is simply a simulation, and we're experiencing what evolution had to do to keep it under control, right? So I don't think it gets really complicated. This is not like collapsing of the wave function to, or some connection to, quantum field theory or anything crazy like that. It doesn't have to be, right? That's sort of like saying that, aliens are in the sky because I saw this light. No, like, how about we keep it as simple as possible and prove that wrong first, right? So please prove it wrong. And from there, I think we can build really awesome AI tools. So please comment. Let's have the conversation. I think it's really, really interesting. And yeah, we'll see where we can go with that. Cheers.